This program is brought to you by the University of Michigan. For more information, visit umich.edu.
Steve Warner on the organ, everyone. Yeah, Steve, I have a special note for you today. There's someone in the audience who has traveled here from far away just to see you and wants to see you afterwards. So I think from Palm Springs or something. Anyway, welcome to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. Welcome to all of you. Wow, we finally get the fullest house on the last one. Today is the last of our series for the year. We are very pleased to be presenting design guru Tim Brown today, and I want to thank our partners for their support in this, the College of Engineering, the Design Science Program, and U of M's IDSA student chapter, who actually nominated Tim Brown about 4 years ago for the series. So I hope some of those students are still here that made that nomination. And of course, our faithful series partners, Arts at Michigan and Michigan Radio 91.7 FM. I want to also give a special welcome to some groups in the audience today. We have a group here from Steelcase. We have a group from Johnson Controls. We have folks from George P. Johnson Experience Marketing and one of our alums, along with him. Menlo Innovations, and 50 high school students from the International Academy of Bloomfield Hills. So welcome all of you. It is wonderful to have you in the house with us today. Today's lecture being the final in this, our what we call our Finding Latitude season. I want to just take a moment to go back. I haven't talked about this since the first lecture of the series back in September, so I just want to, for a moment, revisit the definition of latitude. This is the American Heritage College Dictionary definition: extent, breadth, range, space, freedom from normal restraints, limitations, or regulations. And I think in this series, I hope that we've all had a chance through the latitudinarians, which is the next word in the dictionary after latitude, defined as one who favors freedom of thought and action. I think everyone that has joined us this year on stage has been a qualified latitudinarian. I hope that they have brought you some kind of light on your own perception and definition of your own space and finding your room in the world. So, and if you haven't yet found it, I'm sure Tim Brown will do this for you today. A few thank yous, as this is the last lecture of the season. There's a lot of folks that have a big role in making this series possible. Of course, Penny and Rose Stamps, our patrons, who we wouldn't be here without, and our Dean of the School of Art and Design, Brian Rogers. Also Mary Schmidt, who's the Associate Dean, who does a lot of work organizing all the students on this series. Our visitors committee, Cynthia Pachikara, Osmond Kahn, and Ed West, who have worked with me diligently this year. All of our student and faculty hosts that help with our guests, everyone who's made a speaker nomination, even if they don't show up here, we go through those and they mean a lot, and everyone should always nominate for the series. The Michigan Theater and its wonderful crew, we are so pleased that we are able to come to you from this amazing space. Especially our every week IATSE union guys that make sure this happens. Walter in the projection booth, and Rico back doing sound and lights. I love these guys. Wonderful. A very, very, very special thank you to a person that helps me almost every day, my faithful assistant, Bruna, who is going to be graduating on May 1st. She's worked for me for 4 years. She's going to be graduating from the Ross School of Business. She's an amazing young lady, and I know she's going to get a fantastic job. So thank you so much, Bruna. We do videotape all of the lectures, so for those of you who are just joining us today and finding out about this series and want to see all of the fantastic people that you've missed this year, you can find our videos online as podcasts on iTunes, and we also broadcast them locally on the Michigan channel, Channel 24. And I want to thank Ian Line and his faithful cameramen here who have been putting those out this year, so do check those out over the summer. The new season for next year will be announced in June, so you can look at our website, and I hope all of you will be back again with us next year. We will have another great season. Today, we will have a Q&A with Tim Brown following the lecture. This, for those of you who don't know, are not used to the theater, we don't have the question and answer in here. When you exit the theater, go left down a long hallway, and you'll find yourself in the lobby of a smaller screening room, and that's where we will meet for the Q&A. He will also be signing books for those of you who brought books. If you didn't bring books, Nicola's Books is in the lobby, and we'll have books for sale. So pick up a book. Come to the Q&A. And now I want to introduce someone very special who is from the U of M School of Public Policy.
It's not me that you're introducing.
No.
I'm giving this to you and I'm interrupting you.
Oh my God, you're interrupting me.
I'm so sorry. I would never do it if there wasn't a good cause. So one last thank you to you. Okay? You can't thank yourself, Christina.
Thank you very much,
And
Caitlin.
that's from the graduating seniors. Thank you for 4 years.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. It's my pleasure. Absolutely.
And now,
To give us an introduction of Tim Brown, I want to welcome to the stage a very precocious sophomore here at the U of M, studying in the School of Public Policy. He is also the leader of what will be this Saturday, the first ever TEDx at U of M. I hope some of you will be joining him for that. I welcome to the stage Alex Odell.
Wow, Tim Brown, who's excited? Tim Brown is the CEO of the innovation and design firm IDEO. IDEO is one of the 20 most innovative companies in the world. They've created such products as the Apple Mouse and the Palm V. Tim Brown has personally been a huge advocate for bringing enterprise and sustainability for low-income groups. IDEO recently released the Human-Centered Design Toolkit, which NGOs and social enterprise groups use to solve issues for low-income brackets. It currently has over 30,000 downloads and used in 160 countries. Tim Brown is also a veteran of TED conferences, and I've personally taken a lot of inspiration from Tim Brown on his talks on simplicity, creativity, design-based thinking. And we hope to bring that same kind of inspiration to TEDx U of M this Saturday. TEDx U of M was organized by 40 students at the University of Michigan, and we're looking to display the most interesting thinkers and doers of the Ann Arbor community and the university. And although space is limited, we invite for you to join us through our live stream at TEDxUofM.com. We feel firmly in a belief that as we move forward, it's vital that we have community spaces to hear ideas and to share our own and to take inspiration from that. And I have no doubt that after today, you will be inspired by what Tim Brown has to say. And it is with great pleasure and honor that I welcome to the stage Tim Brown.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is tremendous to be here. This is a huge theater. How wonderful. Wow. All right. Let's see. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about what happens when we go from design to design thinking. And so I'm going to start off with a little bit of my own design history. This is actually, for those design students in the class, a really crummy picture of my first ever project. My first ever professional project, that is. The first thing I was ever hired to design and get paid for it. I was actually an intern, and I was asked by a very small company in the north of England to help them design woodworking machines. This is actually a sketch of a woodworking machine. And my job was to make it a little easier to use, a little easier to manufacture, slightly better to market. And I think I did a pretty decent job. In fact, if you visit factories, woodworking factories in the north of England today, some 25 years later, you'll still see these machines being used. And I'm sure many of you do that on your vacations. I like to do it. So the only thing is, what you won't find is the company that made them. They went out of business just a couple of years after I'd done my design. And what I didn't realize at the time was that the problem wasn't so much what's the future of woodworking machines as what's the future of the woodworking industry. This is a project I did just a little bit later. It's really kind of the second thing I did that got manufactured. And this is a fax machine. Now, anybody who's less than about 30 years old probably doesn't even know what this thing does. But again, my task was to wrap an attractive container, if you will, around some what was then new technology to make it more attractive and more marketable. Now, this thing was out of production within 18 months. And then now my teenage daughters don't even know what the technology is. So that didn't last very long. So it occurred to me that an awful lot of what passes for design is not all that important. Making things look a little bit more attractive, making them a bit easier to use and a bit more marketable. And that by focusing on a design, I was being pretty incremental and the impact was small. But I think this small view of design is a relatively recent phenomena, and it really grew up in the latter half of the 20th century as design became a tool of consumerism. And so when we think about design, and especially when we read about design in the popular press, we're often talking about products like these. Amusing, yes. Desirable, perhaps. Important, maybe not. But this wasn't always the way. I'd like to suggest that if we consider design differently and stop focusing so much on the object, but instead focusing on design as an approach, it will result in greater impact in the world. Now, you're going to get quite a bit of British history today. I apologize for that. Are there any? I can't really tell. Are there any Brits in the room? Anybody comes from England? Anybody who knows who this guy is? Yeah? Excellent, excellent. This is indeed England's most famous engineer. In fact, in a poll not very many years ago, he was voted by Brits as, I think, the third most important Englishman ever, after Shakespeare and Newton, I think. That's not bad for an engineer. He designed many great things in his career, including in the 19th century, including the first tunnel under the Thames at Rotherhithe and the first suspension bridge at Clifton in Bristol. Now, I grew up living quite close to his most famous creation, his most famous innovation, and that was the Great Western Railway in the south of England. It goes from London to the west coast of England. And in fact, what I loved to do as a kid was cycle along the side of the railway waiting for the Great Bit Express trains to roar past, much to the horror of my mother. You can see it represented here in the famous painting by J.M.W. Turner. It's called Rain, Steam, and Speed. And Brunel imagined building a railway that created the experience, what he talked about, creating the experience for passengers of floating across the countryside. That was an incredible idea. He didn't just want to build a railway, he wanted to build a railway where we floated across the countryside. This was 1860. And that meant building the longest viaducts that had ever been yet created on a railway. This one is actually over the River Thames at Maidenhead. And the longest tunnels that ever been created, including the one at Box in Wiltshire. But he didn't stop there. He went beyond designing the best railway journey he could to imagining an integrated transportation system where it might be possible for a passenger to embark on a train in London and disembark from a ship in New York. One journey from London to New York. It was a really big idea. And this is the SS Great Western, one of the first transatlantic steamships that he built to take care of the second half of that journey. Now, although this was more than a century before the existence of design as a profession, before people like me started turning up and getting paid to be designers, but I think that what Brunel was using was design thinking to solve problems and create world-changing innovations. But what does that mean? Design thinking begins with what Roger Martin, who's the dean of the business school at the University of Toronto, calls integrative thinking. The ability to exploit opposing ideas or constraints to create entirely new solutions. Solutions that are better than the alternatives or the existing ideas that might exist in the world. In design thinking, this requires balancing what is desirable with what is technologically feasible, with what is economically viable. Breakthrough design, like the Great Western, often stretches that balance to the very limit. So somehow we went from this to this. We went from systems thinkers who were reinventing the world to a priesthood of folks in black turtlenecks and designer glasses working on small things. As our industrial society matured, so design became a profession and focused on a steadily smaller canvas until it came to stand for image, aesthetics, and fashion. Now, by the way, I'm a fully paid-up member of that priesthood, and I do actually have my designer glasses somewhere, and I often wear a black turtleneck. But it's a bit of a problem, I think. But I think design is getting big again, and I think that's the opportunity. And the way that is happening is through the application of design thinking to new kinds of problems. Problems in climate change, healthcare, clean water, education, social services. And as we see this reemergence of design thinking as something that can have significant impact and create important innovations, there are some basic ideas that we can observe and learn from. And I'd like to share with you some of those over the next few minutes, and some of the new problems that these ideas are being applied to. So the first and perhaps most fundamental idea about design thinking is that it is human-centered. It may integrate technology and economics, but it begins with what humans need or might need, what makes life easier, more enjoyable, what makes technology more useful and usable. But that's more than simply good ergonomics. It's more than about where we put the buttons on our latest cell phone. It's often about understanding culture and context in order to begin to know even where to begin to have new ideas. And so here, when a team was working in India on a new vision screening program, they had to understand what excited and motivated these school kids to understand how they may play a role in screening the eyes of their parents. Conversion Sound has developed a new ultra-low-cost, high-performance digital hearing aid for developing countries. In the West, these hearing aids are fitted by highly trained technicians. But in India, these technicians are simply too expensive. They're unaffordable, not available. So it took a team working in India with patients and community health workers to see how a PDA application could be used to replace a trained technician in a diagnostic and fitting service. Instead of beginning with the technology, the team started with culture and people. And a bit closer to home, it is by looking and following and observing people that we often recognize behaviors that we can build from and that we can innovate from. So when a team was working with the Bank of America on the problem of why do we not save enough as Americans, they went out and visited and spent time with families. And they observed a couple of interesting things. One thing that they observed was that there were some people would do this. When they paid their utility bill, they would round it up to the nearest $10 or the nearest dollar. And when they asked, well, why do you do that? I mean, why do you give the utility company more money than they're asking for? That doesn't seem like a good idea. What they always said was, I don't want to get caught out. I don't want to feel behind. I want to be ahead of the system. That was interesting. Another behavior that they observed is one that perhaps many of us recognize, which is that when people would go out and make a cash transaction, pay for something like a cup of coffee, they would take the coins that they got in return, and instead of spending them, they would take them home, stick them in a cookie jar or cookie tin, and every so often give that tin to their kids to take in and pay into their savings account. And again, this was a way of kind of simply and automatically saving. So those two simple observations, when combined with the idea of a debit card, led to a new service called Keep the Change, which Bank of America launched about 3 or 4 years ago. Which what happens here is every time you spend money with your debit card, the transaction is rounded up by Bank of America to the nearest dollar, and the change that you would otherwise have got gets put into your savings account. So it automatically you automatically save every time you spend with your debit card. This has resulted in over 2 million new accounts and more than $2 billion of savings. So by taking this notion of recognizing a behavior, recognizing what people do kind of every day, and using that as a source of inspiration for new ideas, we get to interesting innovation. So if design thinking starts with the idea of being human-centered, it moves quickly to learning by making things, from thinking about what to build to building in order to think. Prototypes speed up the innovation process because we only learn about our ideas when we put them out into the world and have them tested by the real world. And the sooner you do that, the sooner you learn about the quality of your ideas and evolve them. Okay. An awful lot has been written about this wonderful institution called the Aravind Eye Institute in Madurai in India. They managed to serve vast numbers of very poor people by using the revenues from paying patients to cross-subsidize those who can't afford to pay for eye surgery and cataract surgery. In fact, more than 2/3 of the patients that they serve for free. They're incredibly efficient, but they're also very innovative. And what I noticed when I went and visited them was they have this amazing willingness to prototype their ideas very quickly and very early. Now this is a photograph of their manufacturing facility for one of their greatest cost breakthroughs. They make the lenses, the plastic lenses that replace our own lenses when we have cataracts. They take away the existing lens and put this plastic lens in its place. And by doing this, they've brought the cost down from $200 a pair when manufactured and sold by Western manufacturers to just $4 a pair. And that's one of the reasons they can afford to serve so many patients for free. And this was made possible, I believe, by their prototyping mentality. Instead of building some fancy big factory, they put the facility in the basement of one of their existing hospitals. And instead of using large-scale machinery like the Western manufacturers, they used low-cost CAD/CAM prototyping machinery to make these lenses. They're now the biggest manufacturer of these lenses and other ophthalmic supplies in the developing world. And they've recently finally moved into a custom factory they've built for the purpose. So if human need is the place to start, and prototyping is this vehicle for progress, it's the way we evolve our ideas quickly, then there are also questions to be asked about the destination. Instead of thinking of seeing consumption as its primary objective, design thinking is beginning to explore the potential of participation. The shift from a passive relationship between producer and consumer to an active engagement of everyone in experiences that are meaningful, profitable, and productive. Some more British history. So when Sir William Beveridge wrote the first of his reports in 1942, he proposed what became Britain's welfare state, in which he hoped that all citizens would be active participants in their own social welfare. But by the time he wrote his third report, he confessed that he had failed, and instead had created a society of welfare consumers. Now, there's a small group, a design group in England, Hilary Cottam, Charlie Ledbetter, and Hugo Manasai of Participle, that's the design group, have taken this idea of participation, and in their manifesto called Beveridge 4.0, this is the fourth report he never wrote, they've described a model for reinventing the welfare state. And one of their projects is this one. It's called Southwark Circle, in which a team of designers worked with residents, local residents in Southwark in South London to create a new membership organization that helps the aged take care of household tasks. Ideas were refined and prototyped with 150 older people and their families before the service was launched last year, and it's now being rolled out across the country. And I think these kinds of participatory systems in which members of the community help support, in this case, older people, but also members of the community help design the solution, and where many more forms of value are generated beyond simply cash, is going to be the major theme, not only for design, but perhaps for our economy as a whole. Continuing on the topic of participation, recently, one of the things that we've been trying to do at IDEO is expand the conversation about climate change and move beyond this kind of constant barrage of what we'll have to give up in order to tackle climate change, and begin to talk about what we might create. So if it's something you're interested in, you can go and visit the site. It's called livingclimatechange.com, and it consists of a series of scenarios. The initial ones were created by designers at IDEO, but now they're getting posted by designers from all over the world. In fact, there's a competition that we've launched recently for colleges and schools to post design scenarios around climate change. And we're trying to get designers to participate in this conversation, which up until now has been dominated by policymakers and scientists. And we can take the idea of participation perhaps to its logical conclusion and say that one of the most effective ways that design can have impact is if design thinking is taken out of the hands of designers and put into the hands of everyone. This is not something my friends who are designers like me to say, but so a team of nurses at the healthcare system Kaiser Permanente, which is over on the West Coast, tackled the problem of improving the patient experience. And one topic they focused on was the exchange of knowledge between nurses, and particularly the way they change shifts. So based on a design process of observational research, brainstorming new solutions, and rapid prototyping, they developed a completely new way of changing shifts. And instead of retreating to the nurses' station to tell each other about the various states and needs of patients, they developed an approach for updating on the ward in front of patients using a new software tool. And this innovation brought the time that nurses were away from patients down from 40 minutes to 12 minutes on average. It increased patient confidence because patients could see what was happening in front of them, and it increased nurse happiness. If you multiply that by all the nurses on all the shifts, on all the wards of 40 hospitals, which Kaiser have, that results in a relatively significant impact. And this is just one of thousands of opportunities in healthcare alone for innovation. You might recognize that image. Unfortunately, one thing we've come to learn is that design, good ideas, don't sell themselves. And indeed, a whole industry grew up in the 20th century built to tell stories, to encourage us to consume more. And that shot from Mad Men was an example of that. And yet, when the goal is not so much to create consumption, but to create participation, we need more than stories. We need movements. One movement that I want to tell you about is one that happened in Japan just a few years ago. Coming up to the end of the Kyoto Protocol, or the deadline for the Kyoto Protocol, the Japanese government decided, as the treaty was signed in our country, we probably should do something about trying to meet our commitments. And so one of the things they did is the government teamed up with a creative agency called Hakuhodo and tried to figure out what how could we get ordinary citizens to make a difference? What are the simple behavioral changes that we might explore that could make a difference? And so one of the ones that they identified was the temperature of the air conditioning systems in Japanese office buildings in the summer. They're set to a very low temperature because it's a hot, humid country. And one of the reasons why it's set to a very low temperature is because Japanese businessmen insist on wearing formal suits and ties. And so the notion was, well, you know, if we could just persuade Japanese businessmen not to wear ties, we might be able to raise the temperature on these thermostats and lower the amount of air conditioning we're doing and lowering the amount of carbon we're producing. One of the side benefits of doing this, by the way, would be that the temperature would no longer be so cold that all Japanese business women would no longer have to have blankets over their knees when they're sat in their formal skirts at work. So that was the idea. How do we get Japanese businessmen to change their behavior? Now that's a big challenge because Japanese businessmen are rather conservative. So two things happened. Firstly, they convinced all of the best-known Japanese fashion designers to design a new range of casual clothing. And then they got the CEOs of all the major corporations in Japan, plus the Prime Minister, this is Prime Minister Koizumi over here, to model these clothes. They had a huge fashion show, and all the CEOs were the models. They're not the best-looking fashion models, but they did show that this new clothing had existed. And then the second thing they did was as part of this Cool Biz, is what they called it, as you may have guessed. They created these badges, and any company that had signed up to Cool Biz any employee that was wearing one of these badges and wearing casual open-necked clothing at work, you were not allowed to criticize them for their clothing. So it created permission. And in Japanese business culture, that was quite important, the notion of creating permission. And so between these two things, the design of the clothing and the design of the kind of badging and communications, got thousands of companies to sign up to CoolBiz and saved tens of thousands of tons of carbon emissions. And they went on to create WarmBiz, which is the same idea but for the winter. So now it's okay to wear a woolly jumper, or it was a woolly sweater, sorry, I'm talking, to work. So that's an idea of a movement that uses design to change behavior. Another movement which I think is tremendous and which we're kind of experiencing a little bit in the US right now is one by this guy, Jamie Oliver. I don't know, has anybody watched Jamie's Food Revolution yet? I think it's great reality TV. I love it. So his first effort was in England, this thing called Jamie's School Dinners, where by a similar kind of thing that he's trying to do in the US, he convinced the UK government to spend over $1 billion on reinventing and retooling the British school lunch program, so to create healthy food for British school kids. And now he's trying to do the same thing for the rest of us with his Food Revolution, which if you haven't watched it, it's on ABC TV, I think on Friday evenings. It's well worth a watch. And indeed, he recently won the TED Prize, which is a prize that's given away at the TED conference every year, the biggest piece of which is not the money, which you get quite a bit of money, but the biggest piece of which is the opportunity to make this wish in front of the TED audience. And so far, he's had over 1,000 individuals and corporations volunteer help for his prize, which is to find ways to re-educate us all in America in order to reduce obesity. So he's trying to get a movement started. We were working recently on another topic which I think potentially deserves thinking of as a movement, and that's the notion of underage pregnancy. And we were working with a national campaign to prevent teen and unplanned pregnancy, because 6 in 10 pregnancies to women aged 20 to 24 are unplanned, and half of all, unexpected, and half of all pregnancies in the US are unplanned. So the particular goal for this project was to reduce unplanned pregnancies amongst unmarried adults. And at the core of this is a website and a reminder service to act as a one-stop kind of shopping and educational resource for young people. And so this is one page of the website, and it's a sort of a resource guide for various forms of contraception, some of which I imagine are more effective than others. The champagne cork, I'm not quite sure where that one comes from, but anyway. So this is the website. But another piece of it is the website's all very well and the resources are very well, but people have actually got to go and use it. And so part of this thing was to create a whole campaign to go to college campuses and workplaces to try and encourage people to kind of take notice of this issue. So on the left here, this is a poster that talks about the average parenting skills of the average 20 or 21-year-old, male, that is, not too great. And on the left is a poster that goes into women's bathrooms. And it's not so clear from that image quite how it works, but I'll show you a picture of the prototype, and it gives you a better idea. So the poster is actually only the bottom half. The top half is you as you look at yourself in the mirror. And it gives you this kind of flash forward as to what it might be like. I thought it was quite an effective idea. So let's go back to Brunel here, and these are just some of the approaches that I just talked that design thinking takes. This idea of being human-centered, this idea of using prototyping, this notion of participation rather than consumption as something that we ought to be interested in. This idea of telling stories and ultimately creating movements. These are just some of the ideas that we're kind of exploring and that are kind of based on design. And that are perhaps leading us to be able to ask some bigger questions than what's the latest trendy product going to be. But I'd like to go back to Brunel and propose a connection that may explain why this is happening now and why design thinking is particularly valuable. And that connection is change. Times of great change demand new solutions and new alternatives. Brunel worked at the height of the Industrial Revolution, when every aspect of our life and our society and was being reinvented. Now, many of those industrial systems of Brunel's time have run their course, and indeed they're part of the problem today. But even so, we live in the midst of perhaps, you could argue, even more massive change than he did, much of it driven by a different kind of technology. And that change is forcing us to question some fundamental components of our society, things like healthcare, government, education, security. And in periods of change, we need new solutions simply because our existing solutions are being obsoleted. They're no longer relevant. They no longer work. But why design thinking? Why does that help? Well, because it changes the way we tackle problems. Instead of defaulting to our normal convergent approach, where we try and select the best choice out of existing alternatives, design thinking encourages us to diverge, to explore new alternatives, create new choices that had never existed before. But before we can start that process, there's an important first step. What's the question we're trying to answer? Now, for Brunel, it might have been this one. I don't know that it was, but it might have been. How do I take a train from London to New York? The answer to that question is not obvious, but he got to an answer. But what are the big kinds of questions we should be asking today? Now, what turns me on as a designer, and the thing that I get excited about when I get up every morning, is the sort of big, interesting questions. And we're very lucky, you know, at IDEO we get asked all kinds of interesting questions. We try and ask them ourselves. This is an intentional eye test, but this is just a list of some of the questions that we've been working on just over the last year or two. And lots, and constantly getting asked interesting questions. And it's what drives me creatively, it's what excites me, is the opportunity to ask and attempt to answer some of these questions. One that we've been working on recently that I think is quite a big one is within a project that we've been working on with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Acumen Fund, and it's this one. How might we improve access to safe drinking water for the world's poorest people, and at the same time stimulate innovation amongst local water providers? Just a simple little project. You can knock that one out in a couple of weeks, right? Well, instead of having a bunch of American designers and having them come up with new ideas that may or may not have been relevant, we tried to take a more open, collaborative and participative approach. And so we teamed designers and investment experts from the Acumen Fund, that's a social investment fund in New York, with 11 water organizations initially in India. And then through a series of workshops, they explored new products, new services, and new business models. We then held a competition, and we asked each of these organizations to kind of put forward their ideas and their plans for how they would innovate in their own particular sector of this clean water distribution problem. And then out of those that entered the competition, we awarded seed funding to 5 of them. And then designers from IDEO and folks from the Acumen Fund worked with these teams for over many weeks, helping them design new social marketing campaigns, community engagement strategies, new business models, water vessels, and distribution services. And that was just about a year ago that we worked on that. And those solutions are now beginning to roll out into the marketplace in India. And we're starting to see some early signs of impact. In one case, an NGO that creates village-scale water filtration programs, systems, found that by redesigning the way that they tell the community about what this how this system works, making that more of a designed experience, they increased the number of subscribers to this clean water facility by over 5 times. So just one example of some early impact. We hope to see more. And now the same process has since been rolled out also in Kenya with a series of NGOs there. Now for me, this project, although it's still early and we don't yet know ultimately what the impact's going to be, but it's an example of how far design thinking can go from tackling the kinds of small problems that I talked about from the beginning of my career. It shows that by focusing on the real needs of people, by using prototypes to move these ideas along quickly, and that by getting the process out of the hands of designers and into the hands of the community and getting the community's participation, that we can apply it to some more important and big questions. And that just like Brunel, by thinking about systems, design can ultimately have a greater impact. So I'm going to kind of wrap up in a second, but I think that part of our kind of responsibility, and not just as designers, but any of us that are interested in sort of tackling these kinds of issues, is to begin to ask the questions. And so, you know, there are some various domains, some areas where I think we should be asking questions quite urgently, particularly here in this country. And so just as an example, I mean, this is not in any way even remotely exhaustive. You know, I think that 3 areas that, you know, I'm doing quite a lot of work on today and that we at IDEO are working on quite a lot, but I think are tremendous opportunities for design thinking are these 3. How do we reinvent health? How do we encourage sustainable consumption? And how do we imagine perhaps a new role for media? And I'll talk about what each of those mean perhaps. So when it comes to health, for me the problem with healthcare is not that we've got a broken insurance system, although we certainly do. It's not even that our hospitals don't work as well as they might, although they don't. The real issue is that we have no hope of creating a sustainable healthcare system until essentially we get health kind of largely out of the hands of doctors and into all of our hands. We all have to take responsibility for healthcare. In other words, health has to become a life skill, not something where we run to the doctor when we're sick. I mean, we obviously will still have to do that, but we can prevent. I mean, 75% of our healthcare costs are driven by chronic disease. Chronic disease is all about our behavior. It's not about nasty infectious diseases. It's about the way we behave, about how much we eat, how little we exercise, how stressed out we get at work, whatever it might be. And we're only going to deal with these health issues if we can somehow find ways of making health a life skill. So let's start with kids. It may be too late for most of us, although there are a bunch of high school kids here. It's not too late for you. Maybe we can find ways of using technology. You know, what would a healthcare version of Facebook look like? Can we create ways of building communities that help people stay healthier? Communities do help us stay healthier. Families help us stay healthier. So can we use technology to do that? Can we better illustrate the connection between nutrition, exercise, and health? Tremendous opportunity. Can we use technology literally to get healthcare into our own hands? I think it's an area that we can spend a lot of time and create a lot of impact. Another one, this issue of sustainable consumption. There's nothing wrong with consumption. Our problem with consumption today is we throw everything away. We use these resources that are irreplaceable, and then we throw them all away. And, you know, that's a pretty kind of lazy form of design. And, you know, I take lots of responsibility. I mean, as a designer, one of my biggest contribution to the world is thousands of tons of landfill. I'm pretty sure that the 95% of the products I've designed in my career are now in a landfill somewhere. They're not still being used. They've not become heirlooms. They're in landfill. And that's not so great. And so part of it is, you know, can we design products that are more valuable, that people want to keep longer, that somehow have a longer life? But I think it's more than that. I think we actually have to redesign the systems through which we produce and consume. We have to design things that don't have a beginning and an end. They go round and round in loops. That the resources and materials that we feed in, somehow we take out and reuse again. And that's hard to do. It's technically and scientifically hard to do, but it's not impossible. And there are already examples of people doing it. And maybe we can even go beyond that and say, well, maybe we don't actually have to consume quite so much physical stuff in order to get the value that we're looking for. And that goes back to this notion of participation that I was talking about before. I think we get a lot of value from things that are not physical and tangible, from stuff. We get a lot of value from experiences. We get a lot of value from relationships. We get a lot of value from communities. We get a lot of value from participating in things. So can we design more of the experiences that we have in the world to extract more value in that way and less from the physical stuff? So it's a big issue. It's something that designers are going to have to tackle over the next few coming years, and it's something we're all going to have to tackle. And then this last one, it may seem a little weird to talk about media, but I think media's got a huge role to play in helping create the kinds of behavior changes that we need in order to tackle some of our most pressing problems. Again, when we talk about healthcare, we talk about financial services and kind of economic resilience. We talk about climate change. Really, when you think about it, the kind of change we're talking about, the sort of impact we're talking about, is only going to happen if every one of us changes our behavior in some way. And that is a tremendously difficult thing to do, and not something that we can do on our own. We need help. Media is a very powerful tool for creating behavior change, and we've seen examples of it. We've seen, at the advertising industry make its contribution towards the anti-smoking campaign. There have been some pretty memorable and the anti-drugs campaign. We all remember, Your Brain on Drugs, the fried egg in the pan. So the media has played a role, but it can play a much bigger role. It can play a much bigger role in educating us, informing us. I think the Jamie Oliver show is actually quite a nice example of media playing a role, not only to entertain us, but to tackle a topic that's a big issue, that's got some purpose to it, and that perhaps gives us a sense of purpose. So I'd love to see media reinventing itself, and the guys in LA and New York perhaps making a slightly bigger contribution to our society, rather than just creating a bunch of couch potatoes. So, I like to believe that design thinking does have a potential to make a difference. And that difference is beyond the latest products on the high street. Not that that's not important, and I still like doing products, but I'd like to think that design can make a contribution beyond that. But to do that, we have to go back to thinking about design in this more expansive way. More like Brunel, and less the domain of a professional priesthood. And the first step is to start asking the right questions. Thank you very much.